She's already gone. The desert took her, and the desert doesn't hand anything back. Renko said it the way some men say, grace, automatic, certain, already moving on to the next thing. He didn't look up from the map. He didn't ask to see a body. He had built a whole career on the idea that his judgment was a kind of weather, something that simply happened to other people. And tonight that judgment told him. A woman with a shattered leg buried under 40 feet of cold scree was a problem that had already solved itself. When his communications officer, a careful young man named Brunner, who had radioed twice for a verification sweep, opened his mouth to say it a third time, Renko crossed the room and took him by the throat of his jacket and put him against the wall, hard enough to crack the plaster. He didn't shout. That was the thing people who survived him always remembered. He never raised his voice. He simply explained, in a low and reasonable tone, that the next man who confused caution with cowardice would be walking back to the capital, and then he let Brunner drop and poured himself 2 fingers of something amber and went back to his maps. It was the kind of certainty that costs men everything. The certainty of someone who has spent so long being obeyed that he has stopped noticing the difference between being obeyed and being right. He had given an order, and the order had become true in his mind the moment it left his mouth, and so the woman in the ravine was dead, and the matter was closed, and he had a war to run. That single decision, that small lazy contempt, would turn his outpost into a field of black glass before the sun came up. Before this goes any further, if you're listening right now, do me a favor. Subscribe, stay with the story to the end, and drop a comment telling me what town you're hearing this from. I genuinely want to see how far it travels tonight. All right, here's how it actually happened. The last thing Delia Brandt heard before everything went dark and silent was the sound of boots in the gravel, and the important detail, the one she would turn over in her mind for weeks afterward, was the direction. The boots were moving away from her, not toward, away. She had been lying face down in the bottom of a dry wash for what her body insisted was an hour, and her training insisted was closer to 9 minutes. Her cheek was pressed into stone that had given up its heat the second the sun went down, the way high desert does, swinging from oven to icebox in the space of an afternoon. Her left leg was wrong. She knew it without looking, the way you know a word is misspelled before you can say why. The angle of it, the strange disconnected weight, the way it ignored her completely when her brain sent down the order to move. Somewhere between the blast and the landing, something in there had come apart. The RPG had caught the rock face above her, and the overpressure had thrown her clean off the trail into the wash, and she'd come down across a slab of granite with her whole left side taking the introduction. She'd felt the snap travel all the way up into her hip. But she was breathing, slow, shallow, controlled, the way they drilled it into her, until it was no longer a skill but a reflex, until staying quiet under the worst moment of your life was as automatic as flinching was for everybody else. Staff Sergeant Delia Brandt, call sign Ember, 31 years old, 9 years in the Army, 4 deployments, a bronze star she never wore, and a particular set of skills that the men around her had spent her first 18 months trying very hard to believe she didn't really have. She'd shot expert on every range they put her on, and every single time some staff sergeant or some butter bar lieutenant had asked to see the targets himself, had squinted at the groupings the way you'd squint at a check you suspected was forged. Are these yours, Brandt? You sure these are right? She'd stopped letting it land years ago. Mostly, she was breathing and she was listening. Brandt's down. That was Doyle, maybe 30 feet up the wash, maybe less. Close enough that she could hear something shaking under his words, and she cataloged it the way she cataloged everything, without judgment, just data. Not grief, fear. He was scared, and a scared man tells himself stories. I saw her go over. That blast, man, nobody walks away from that. You verify? That voice was flatter, cleaner. Lieutenant Mercer, and she'd recognized him before he finished the second word. He had a way of speaking when he was running numbers in his head, and the numbers were always about cost and never about people. And right now she understood with total clarity that to Mercer, she had become a variable, a figure to be carried or canceled. No time, Doyle said. The perimeter's folding. We stay another 5, we lose the whole element. 2 seconds of nothing. She counted them. 1, 2. Then we move, Mercer said. Just like that. And the slap of boots picking up speed and the sound of her team, dissolving into the dark, leaving her in a ditch in a country whose name most of the people she loved couldn't have found on a map. She held still for a full minute after the last footstep faded. That was the discipline. Everything in her wanted to scream, to call out, to demand they come back and finish the job they'd started by deciding she was fragile. The discipline held. You don't move until you're certain. You don't make a sound until you own the field. So she lay in the cold dark and she breathed. And only when the silence had gone completely flat did she turn her head very slowly and look down at her leg. Yeah, that was bad. She got her elbows under her and pulled, and the pain arrived like a building falling on her. Not sharp anymore, but huge and deep, a pressure that seemed to come from inside the bone itself. She breathed through it the way a master sergeant named Optician. No, the way an old instructor at Fort Moore had taught her when she was 22 and convinced she was made of something that didn't break. In through the nose, out through the mouth. He'd been wrong about her, that instructor. She could break. She was in several places, broken right now. But there is a difference between a thing that breaks and a thing that quits, and that difference was the entire story of her life. Her rifle was still across her back. She'd had it slung tight when the round hit and the sling had held, and that small mechanical fact was the difference between a woman with options and a woman with none. She brought it around and ran her hands over it in the dark, checking it the way you'd check a child after a fall. The optic was intact. The barrel was clear. She thumbed the magazine and felt the spring tension and did the 11 rounds. One magazine. 11. Now, here is the part that a lot of people watching get hung up on, and it's a fair thing to get hung up on, so let's deal with it square. She was a quarter-mile from an enemy outpost full of weapons and ammunition. Why not pick up a rifle off a man she put down? Why crawl into an armory and crawl out the same way she went in? The answer is the kind of answer that only sounds like an excuse if you've never had to bet your life on a tool you couldn't trust. A rifle you don't know is a liability, not a gift. You don't know it's zero. You don't know if the last man to carry it kept it clean or ran it dry or bent the sights against a rock. Their ammunition wouldn't seat in her weapon, and her optic was calibrated to her own rifle and her own habits down to the half-second. In a fight measured in fractions, the gun you know cold beats two guns you're praying about every time. So no, she did not go shopping. She had 11 rounds and a weapon that fit her like her own hand. And she had decided sometime in the last 60 seconds, in the silence after Mercer said move, that 11 would have to be enough, because there was a second thing she knew, and it was worse than her leg. The team hadn't just been running a presence patrol. They'd been the early element ahead of a coalition resupply column, 38 souls in soft-skinned trucks, scheduled to roll the valley road at first light. The whole point of Brandt's element had been to clear and watch the high ground and confirm the route. Instead, the high ground had been an ambush, which meant the route was compromised, which meant Renko's people had known, which meant at dawn 38 men and women were going to drive into a kill box with no idea it was there. And the only person left on this side of the line who knew that was lying in a ditch with a leg that pointed two directions at once, she could call it in. She did call it in, low and clipped on her team net, and got nothing but the hiss of dead air. Because of course the relay had gone down with the ambush, because nothing in this kind of work ever breaks just one thing. So she switched to the contingency, a coalition guard frequency she wasn't supposed to know and absolutely did. And after the third try, a voice answered, tired and skeptical, a controller 100 miles away, who had a call sign listed as killed in action on a report someone had already filed. That detail would matter later. For now, she only registered the pause, the half-second of a man checking a screen and finding a name marked dead, and then hearing it speak. She told him what she had. She told him about the column. She told him she could see the outpost from where she lay, and that she intended to be inside it within the hour. And there was another pause, longer this time, the kind of silence a professional makes when a stranger has just said something that is either insane or extraordinary, and he can't yet tell which. Then he started asking the right questions, and she started to move. Moving is a generous word for what she did. She did not run. People always ask how she ran on a broken leg, and the answer is she didn't. She dragged, she crawled, she went hand over hand up the wash, using rocks and roots and the dead weight of her own stubbornness, and it took her the better part of 40 minutes to cover ground a healthy soldier would have walked in 8. She bound the leg with a length of webbing, and the rigid stay out of her own pack lashed it straight enough that the bone ends stopped grinding, and every yard of that crawl was a negotiation with a pain so total it had stopped being pain and become a kind of weather she lived inside. She counted her movements to keep her mind off it. She thought about the 38. She thought about the road at dawn. She did not even once think about Mercer. She filed him. There would be time. The Outpost was a repurposed custom station from some older, calmer century, low stone buildings around a packed dirt yard, a motor pool against the east wall, a fuel point, downwind of everything, because whoever had laid it out hadn't planned on anyone caring. Renko's people had strung wire and dug positions, but they had done it the way men dig when their commander has told them the enemy is already beaten. The eastern wire sagged. A generator covered the sound of her cutting it. She came in low along the wall in the dead space their own floodlights made. A wedge of dark their eyes slid right over because the brain stopped seeing what the light has trained it to ignore. She did not start a gunfight. 11 rounds against a garrison is not a plan, it's an obituary. What she did instead was the thing she was genuinely the best in the world at, the thing none of the men who doubted her scores had ever bothered to understand, which was patience turned into a weapon. She found the armory first, a squat building with a single board sentry, and she didn't shoot him. She waited until he stepped inside to warm his hands, and she set a charge against the main cache with a remote initiator. Because her first demo instructor had told her the finest bomb in the world is the one you can set off from somewhere comfortable. Then she moved to the motor pool and worked a slow knife along the fuel lines of 3 vehicles. Not enough to drip, just enough to weep when they tried to run them. Then the fuel point itself, and a second charge, and a trip line behind the secondary ammunition that any man in a hurry would walk straight into. She built the whole thing the way a chess player builds a position, quietly, each piece doing nothing on its own, all of it waiting. 45 minutes in the cold, dragging that leg behind her like a sentence she was serving, and the only sound she made was the sound the wind was already making. And then she found Renko's command room, and the whole shape of the night changed. He wasn't in it. The lamp was knocked over, still burning at an angle, throwing long shadows. On the table sat a radio, a half-finished drink, and a single sheet of paper, handwritten military stationery. Her language skills were rough, but numbers are numbers, and the time notation at the top of that page was not the time she had built her entire plan around. The coalition response, the air package she'd called for, the strike that was supposed to gut this place before the column ever moved, was timed against a window Renko had quietly shifted, twice. He'd moved the attack on the Valley Road earlier, and he'd done it here, in ink, off the radio net, in handwriting that would never show up in any intercept where no analyst would ever catch it. The rocket battery that would hit the column wasn't firing at first light. It was firing in 14 minutes. The friendly strike package was 19 minutes out. She was 5 minutes short. She stood very still in that crooked lamplight and felt the math settle over her, cold and clean and merciless. 5 minutes between what she had set in motion and what Renko had arranged to happen first. 5 minutes that belonged to 38 people who didn't know yet that they'd already been sold. She keyed the captured radio and the coalition net at the same time and started talking and moving in one motion, because standing still had never once in her life been the answer to anything. Timelines changed, she said. Repeat, timelines changed. Target battery fires in 14. Your package is 19 out. You are short by 5. Give me an alternative or give me a way to buy it. She was back out in the wind before the answer came. 40 seconds of dead air, and she covered 60 yards in those 40 seconds. And in that time, every disaster her mind could build tried to move in, and she evicted each one by counting her own dragging steps. The answer, when it came, was the answer she'd known it would be, and hated anyway. Cannot advance the package. 5-minute gap confirmed. Can you delay the battery's ability to fire? She almost laughed, standing inside a fully alert enemy outpost, alone with 11 rounds and a leg held together by webbing, being asked very politely whether she could reach a rocket battery dug in outside the wire and personally talk it out of doing its job for 5 minutes. Define delay, she said. Disruption. Confusion. Anything that buys the time. And she looked at what she'd already built. The armory. The fuel point downwind of everything. The motor pool primed to burn. She did the arithmetic of human nature, which was the math she trusted most, because she had been right about it more often than she'd been right about anything else. Men do not fire rockets at a road when the base behind them is coming apart. They stop, they grab radios, they scream for orders, they wait 5 minutes, maybe more, maybe exactly 5. If she was right about what a fire does to a frightened garrison and a crew chief who'd been told the enemy was already dead. She pulled the initiator from her vest. She looked east at the armory 50 meters off, at the fuel point bleeding downwind beyond it. She looked at her watch. She keyed the charge. The armory came apart in a single white flash that turned the desert night, for one impossible second, into noon. The shockwave reached her a beat later, and she rode it down against the wall and stayed there as the fuel point caught and the motor pool followed, those wept-out fuel lines doing precisely what she'd built them to do, the whole eastern half of the outpost, climbing into a wall of fire that you could probably see from the Capitol. And out beyond the wire, beside a rocket already loaded and a firing order 90 seconds from execution, a crew chief grabbed his handset and started screaming at his commander to tell him what in God's name was happening inside the base he was supposed to be supporting. The battery did not fire. The road stayed empty of anything but dawn. She found a slot of cover with a sight line to the main gate, and she let herself go still, and she waited. Because the only piece left on the board was Renos himself, and a man like Renko, when his certainty starts burning down around him, does one of two things. He fights or he runs. She'd read his file before the op, 2 tours, a decoration, a court-martial for the handling of prisoners that had been very quietly made to disappear. That was a man who believed the rules were a fence around other people. So she watched the gate and she breathed. And she let the 11 rounds she had left be enough, because in the end, she only needed one. He came out of the smoke at a run, no escort. The bodyguard's a man like that, pays for don't stick around to die for a corpse to be, and his were already gone, scattered into the dark, the second the paymaster stopped looking immortal. He was making for a vehicle that wasn't going to start because she'd seen to that an hour ago. She let him reach it. She let him try the engine twice. She wanted him to understand, in whatever language his panic was using by then, that every door he reached for had been closed by the woman the desert was supposed to have kept. She didn't kill him. That surprises people, and I understand why, but it's the truest thing about her. A bullet was the easy answer, and the small one. She put a round through the engine block and one through the front tire, and the noise and the spray of it dropped him flat in the dirt with his hands over his head. And then she keyed the coalition net one more time and gave them a grid and a description, and the single most valuable sentence of the entire war in that valley. He's alive, and he's talking distance from his own intelligence. Renko dead was a closed file. Renko alive, kneeling in the ash of his own outpost, was a thread, and she had already decided she was going to pull it all the way out. The strike package arrived 19 minutes after she'd first called, exactly as promised, and found nothing left to hit but a base that had already destroyed itself, and a column that had stopped short on a controller's warning, and a single grid where a captured commander sat waiting in the cold. The pilots would say later that the most remarkable thing about that mission was how little there was for them to do. The most significant nothing in that valley in half a year, one of them called it. She'd have appreciated that if she'd been conscious to hear it. Because by then the adrenaline had run out, the way it always does all at once and without warning. Like a floor disappearing. She had dragged herself to a low rise above the road and set a flare in the dirt beside her and lain back to wait. And the cold she'd been holding off by sheer momentum came in through the last of her, and her hands went from screaming to that distant administrative numbness that registers as information instead of feeling. She noted it, filed it. The leg had long since left the realm of things she could file. She lay there and looked up at the smoke-stained dawn and waited, and it turned out she could wait. She had already waited longer than this for less. She heard the helicopter before she saw it. A low thrum the wind tried to swallow and couldn't, a thing she felt in her chest before her ears agreed. It was real. When the bird broke the ridgeline and the spotlight pinned her, she raised one arm. Just the one. That was everything she had left. The medic who came off first was a young staff sergeant named Sato, and she'd learn his name later in the hospital when she finally thought to ask. He dropped into the dirt beside her with the specific speed of a man who'd seen one flare and one heat signature on the map and done the grim arithmetic of what that combination meant. His hands went over her in the fast professional inventory of his trade, and when he reached the leg, he made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "I know," she said. "Sergeant, I need you to." "I know," she said again. "Just get me on the bird." He looked at her face for a second, and something passed between them that wasn't argument and wasn't quite agreement. Just the mutual recognition of two people who understood that certain conversations had already closed. He got her on the bird. The flight to the field hospital ran 20-some minutes, and she was awake for all of it, which she decided afterward was both a mercy and a particular kind of punishment. Because awake meant there was nothing to do but lie there and feel the whole weight of the night arrive at once. The mission math was gone. The narrow, bright tunnel of objective and next step and keep moving was gone. And what was left underneath it was just a woman in a helicopter with a ruined leg and frostbitten hands, registering, slowly and enormously, that she was alive. She hadn't been sure of that until right then. Sato kept talking to her the way medics do when they're worried about shock, easy and steady and almost conversational. And at one point he asked what had happened out there, and she thought about how you'd even begin to answer that, and said, "Long night." And he gave a short laugh that was mostly breath, and said, "Ma'am, that might be the understatement of the whole deployment." She almost smiled. Almost. The hospital took her apart and put her back together over the following days. Fractures, plural, frostbite second degree, both hands, exposure. A surgeon she'd never met rebuilt the leg with hardware and a kind of muttering admiration. And somewhere in the medicated dark, she heard a word that stuck: 8 weeks. 8 weeks until she could stand on it. She filed that too. And while she was filing it, the second story was unfolding in rooms she wasn't in yet, and it was the story that turned everything she'd survived into something more than survival. Because Mercer had filed a report. He'd filed it while she was still in the wash. Killed in action, body unrecoverable, element extracted under fire. Clean, plausible, the kind of report nobody questions because nobody wants to. He'd written her death the way Renko had spoken it, as a thing made true by being said by the right man in the right tone. And then he'd gone back to his quarters and slept. The trouble with that report was that it had a living witness, and the living witness had spent the worst night of her life pulling a thread that didn't stop where anyone expected it to. The man who came to see her, once she was clear enough to talk, was a colonel from the intelligence side named Whitfield, gray and unhurried, the kind of officer who has made a long career out of letting silences do his interrogating for him. He told her what the captured radios and the captured commander had given them. Renko's network reached deeper into the coalition's own structure than anyone had been willing to imagine. And the route that had been compromised, the route her element had been ambushed on, had been sold from the inside. Sold by someone with access to the patrol schedule, the column timing, the whole architecture of the operation. She already knew the name. She'd known it in some closed-off room of herself since the second she heard a flat voice say verify and then say move. "Mercer," she said. Whitfield nodded once, and then he gave her the part she hadn't seen, the part that landed harder than the leg ever had. Mercer's traffic with the network, recovered off Renko's own systems, didn't only sell routes. It managed people. There were references, his words, in his own hand, to a compromised unit structure he'd been maintaining for operational purposes. The analysts had a theory, and the theory was about her. 4 years of recommendations that never came through. A team leadership track that had been suggested and then quietly allowed to die. Every slot that wasn't available, every timing that wasn't right, every your unit needs you where you are. All of it managed, all of it deliberate. He had needed her subordinate. A soldier with her own team was a soldier he couldn't keep in a ravine. So he had spent years engineering her smallness, keeping her good enough to use and constrained enough never to threaten. And the worst part, the part that took her breath, was how perfectly it had worked. She had spent 4 years assuming the ceiling was made of her own limits, when the whole time it had a name and a face and a flat calculating voice. She breathed through that the way she breathed through pain, not swallowing it, acknowledging it, filing it, deciding what to do with it. "What happens now?" she said. And Whitfield reached into a folder and slid a single sheet across the bed. It was a promotion order. Staff Sergeant to Sergeant, first class, effective immediately, with a line citing exceptional conduct and an acceleration she'd been denied for years. Clipped behind it was a second document, an activation order for a specialized reconnaissance action element standing up under joint command. Task Force red line. 6 billets. 1 team lead line. Her name was typed in that line. Standard font, ordinary as a grocery list, and the most extraordinary thing she had ever read. The task force, Whitfield said, is being built to dismantle what's left of Renko's network. 5 nodes still active. You know that intelligence better than anyone alive, because you're the one who pulled it out of a burning outpost on a broken leg. He let that sit. The team is yours to pick. You'll have the theater roster. Request anyone not already committed. He looked at her, and for once there was no silence doing his work for him. "I want you to finish it." She read the line with her name in it twice. She thought about every room she'd walked into where the unspoken assumption was that she'd taken a wrong turn. Every target she'd shot that someone had insisted on counting himself. Every recommendation that had gone in and quietly never come out. Every time she'd been told, in language that ranged from a shrug to an architecture, that the space she was trying to stand in had been built for someone else. She thought about a dry wash in the dark and a flat voice saying, "Then we move," and the decision she'd made in the silence after the boots faded. Not the decision to live, but the decision to finish the job anyway. Not because anyone was watching. Not because there was the smallest guarantee anyone would ever know. Because the mission was the mission, and she was the only one left to run it. "Yes," she said. Not qualified, not softened, just yes, clean and flat and final, the way she made every decision that ever actually mattered. Whitfield nodded and gathered his folder and left her with the orders and the 8 weeks and the long, bright work ahead of building something out of nothing, which she had done before, in worse places, with less time and fewer friends. When she walked out of that hospital, she did it on her own legs. There was a slight favor to the left one, a hitch you'd only catch if you knew to look. And it was the only visible evidence of everything the last 3 weeks had held. Nobody in that corridor watching her move with that quiet purpose would have known what she was carrying. The weight of 38 people who'd driven home to their families because she'd lain in the snow and refused to be a corpse on Mercer's report. The shape of a network that still needed taking apart. The memory of a ravine and a cold dawn and a team that walked away. The names of 6 people she hadn't chosen yet who were about to become the best unit she would ever lead. They'd have seen none of it. They'd have just seen a soldier walking, like she knew exactly where she was going. She did. Sergeant First Class Delia Brandt, call sign Ember, had been written off as dead in a desert on a holiday weekend, and had saved a column of 38, and had burned an outpost down around the man who'd called her already gone, and had pulled the one thread that would unravel 14 months of an enemy's careful work, and had walked out of a hospital on her own 2 feet with the proof of a traitor folded in her jacket. The cold hadn't kept her, the contempt hadn't kept her, nothing had kept her. And now, with an activation order pressed against her chest and 6 empty billets, waiting for the names only she could fill, the truth that Renko had learned too late and Mercer was learning in a cell that very morning was about to be taught to 5 more men across a map. That the single most dangerous mistake you can make, on any ground, in any weather, in any war, is to look at a woman like her and decide she's already finished.